Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, we'll be discussing the sections of The Friend and of 1001 Goals in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We also have a lovely little brief discussion of film examples to accompany the sections, and those films are The Breakfast Club and The Day After Tomorrow. So let's get cracking on with our first section of The Friend. One is always one too many around me. Thus speaks the hermit. Always wants one in the long run that makes two. I and me are always too earnestly in conversation with one another. How could it be endured if they were not a friend? For the hermit, the friend is always the third person. The third person is the cork that prevents the conversation of the other two from sinking to the depths. Alas, for all hermits, there are too many depths. That is why they long so much for a friend and for his heights. Our faith in others betrays wherein we would dearly like to have faith in ourselves. Our longing for a friend is our betrayer, and often with our love we only want to leap over envy. And often we attack and make an enemy in order to conceal that we are vulnerable to attack. At least be my enemy, thus speaks the true reverence that does not venture to ask for friendship. If you want a friend, you must be also willing to wage a war for him. And to wage war, you must be also capable of being an enemy. So in this first little part here, we have really the hermit representing us stuck in our own little rut, as they say, us stuck with our own ideas, opinions, and bias. And it's when we're stuck within that, we sort of become separated off from everybody else and have our own sort of egoism build up in our own heads about what we think about things. And what's great about a friend, of course, is that they can pull us out of all this egoism, demonstrate precisely flaws in our views, move us from the depths back to the heights, ultimately, out of the depths of our own bubble, or burst in our bubble in this given instance, and providing a great way for us to have a much more healthier approach to ourselves and our own opinions and our ideas. And what's quite interesting as well here is when we're searching for a friend as well, he's saying that we ultimately want to make an enemy out of somebody else, but show that we are vulnerable to attack. So that's saying that really we try and pick problems in someone else's view when we ourselves, our own opinions are fragile, and sometimes we'll go out to hurt and say something really mean, hurtful, out of spite or anger towards another person. It's not showing that we ourselves are strong individuals. It's actually the complete opposite of that. Our own views are fragile, our own ideas are fragile, and ultimately the other person's going to be there to be very therapeutic for us. And it moves into that line of breaking down that egoism that you have about your own ideas through a friend. Be my enemy, in the sense of be that critical point for my views, be that way in which you challenge me, and don't just be a simple reflection of just me, in the sense of you don't want just a clone of you sharing your exact same opinions, views, and loves for things. You want someone that's also going to be a challenge for you and your opinions. And at the same time, it's also got that sense of going to battle for the other person, where you can also say, well, I agree with what you say, and actually I'll back you up in the argument as well, if it comes to it. So sort of two things happening at one time, allowing for the friend to challenge our own opinions, and on the other hand, allowing for ourselves to then move out of our own egoism and also back up someone else's view. So continuing on, you should honor even the enemy in your friend. Can you go near to your friend without going over to him? In your friend, you should possess your best enemy. Your heart should feel closest to him when you oppose him. Do you wish to go naked before your friend? Is it in honor of your friend that you show yourself to him as you are, but he wishes you to the devil for it? He who makes no secret of himself excites anger in others. That is how much reason you have to fear nakedness. If you were gods, you could then be ashamed of your clothes. You cannot adorn yourselves too well for your friend, for you should be to him an arrow and a longing for the Superman. Have you ever watched your friend asleep to discover what he looked like? Yet your friend's face is something else beside. It is your own face in a rough and imperfect mirror. Have you ever watched your friend asleep? Were you not startled to see what he looked like? Oh, my friend, man is something that must be overcome. The friend should be a master in conjecture and in keeping silence. You must not want to see everything. Your dream should tell you what your friend does when awake. May your pity be a conjecture, that you may first know if your friend wants pity. Perhaps what he loves in you is the undimmed eye and the glance of eternity. Let your pity for your friend conceal itself under a hard shell. You should break a tooth biting upon it. Thus it will have delicacy and sweetness. Are you pure air and solitude and bread and medicine to your friend? Many a one cannot deliver himself from his own chains, and yet he is his friend's deliverer. Are you a slave? If so, you cannot be a friend. Are you a tyrant? If so, you cannot have friends. So I really love that line, you should honor even the enemy in your friend. Because when we look for friends or for partners in relationships and so forth, we really look for that reflection of ourselves. We really just want somebody to just be ultimately us in order for a very narcissistic sort of approach in a way, in order for us to share the same interests and passions and loves and opinions. And a great example of that, of course, is guys getting all together, going down to the pub, all enjoying a nice game of football together, all supporting the same team. And how dare another friend not support the same team as you? Oh, I can't be friends with them. Or in the same sense for relationships, if you're really passionate about a certain thing, like say Star Wars, and literally you had a bedroom just filled full of memorabilia just of Star Wars things, but you then met this absolutely fantastic person, and then you're absolutely just hitting it off, really clicking and connecting together, but then suddenly they say after a while, I didn't know how to tell you this, but I don't really love Star Wars. And then, of course, their heart's broken. And then it's like, well, I don't think I can be with you anymore. But that's what Nietzsche also wants us to think about here is if we have a friend, in a sense of, do we actually just want us again as another person? No, we don't. Why is that the case? Because that's not what friends do for each other. That's not what partners do in a relationship either. We have to honor the enemy in the sense of we have to honor even the things that we completely disagree with another person, even if we fundamentally, absolutely, within our very core of the being, adhere to Star Wars and follow exactly everything down to a fundamental T, dressing up and following down the exact Jedi code. It's perfectly acceptable for the partner not to want to dress up or love Star Wars because they're their own individual. But at the same time, it's not only about respecting that person as well. It's like the other person allows us to be challenged in that given way. The other person allows us to reevaluate our own thoughts. And in that given instance with Star Wars as well, maybe just a nice positive critical reflection about, am I taking this too far? Is my obsession becoming a bit too obsessive? And it's that little point as well where he says, make sure it's a longing for the Superman, because what the friend does on a deeper sense is touch upon our own sort of idealities, norms that we set up for ourselves in our daily lives and have set up for ourselves over a number of years, and suddenly we're allowed to crack that. Suddenly they're allowed to just have that moment of critical reflection upon our lives. And of course, it can be an incredibly negative thing initially when we think about, oh my God, here is someone who doesn't immediately agree with what I say, or oh my God, they support such and such political party, or they don't like this and they don't like this certain team and so on. But it's all something that's incredibly constructive for us, because it moves us away from all our own biases, our own bubble that we've ultimately created for ourselves. We need to be overcome in that given way. As he says, man is something that must be overcome. Get away from your ideality that you've set up for yourself. Get away from all this nicety. Allow yourself to be challenged. Also, what a great line is, many a one cannot deliver himself from his own chains, and yet he is his friend's deliverer. What such a fantastic line that is as well, especially when you're really deep in depression and you absolutely see no light at the end of the tunnel, and ultimately you just wrap yourself around in the metaphorical chains. You're unable to get yourself out of that position, but then we have, of course, the love of the friend. They're able to get you out of the chains through discussion, through conversation. Then we get sort of like a little stipulation as well. If you're a slave, you cannot be a friend. And what that means is that if you just go around admiring things and just being a complete repetition of what you admire and someone else says, you're not a friend. And also on the opposite side of that as well, if you're a tyrant, so therefore if you just go around demanding everybody just adhere to exactly what you say, you're not a friend either. So the friend sort of slots themselves nicely between the slave and the tyrant. So allowing for that critical thinking to take place, allowing for that process of reevaluating yourself, and having all the lovely therapeutic nature about having a better mental health state for you and all that loveliness at the same time. So rounding off this section as well, Nietzsche says quite sexist things about women. So we're just going to go straight head into it, and we're going to have a great rediscussion about this section as we go, illustrating the problems with it, and then also highlighting at the same time that he does of the problems of men. Let's have a wee discussion about this section that rounds us off. In woman, a slave and a tyrant have all too long been concealed. For that reason, woman is not yet capable of friendship. She knows only love. In a woman's love is injustice and blindness towards all that she does not love. And in the enlightened love of a woman too, there is still the unexpected attack and lightning and night, along with the light. Woman is not yet capable of friendship. Women are still cats and birds, or, at best, cows. Woman is not yet capable of friendship. But tell me, you men, which one of you is yet capable of friendship? Oh, your poverty, you men, and your avarice of soul. As much as you give to your friend, I will give even to my enemy, and will not have grown poorer in doing so. There is comradeship. May there be friendship. Thus spoke Zarathustra. So automatically we can call Nietzsche straight out for this section to say absolutely complete rubbish by focusing this solely on women, because men equally are slaves and tyrants in the sense of men equally can have a complete admiration for another person and therefore just completely repeat what they say verbatim, or they can also act the tyrant in the sense of wanting their viewpoint to be completely just repeated and agreed upon, and that's the way it goes. It's not just solely limited to a specific gender about how this works. As well as we have women related into cows, and of course, what does he mean there? That all what women do is just ruminate and therefore chew upon things and don't think more critically and deeper about things. But again, we can say, Nietzsche, you're talking complete rubbish. Herd mentality here that you're clearly referring to, as well as the fact there's a lack of critical thinking upon things, and everything that you've just said previously in the last sections, you're talking complete absolute rubbish. Why is that the case? Because herd mentality again, and critical thinking, and the problems of lack of critical thinking of things again, is not just solely limited just to women. It's also applicable to men there. And that's more or less what he tries to get in there as a little quick sentence, of course, of about which one of you men are capable of friendship. But he seems just so harsh and driving through several points against women first, before he then slips the men point in, of course. But then it does end on a great line as well. As much you give to your friend, I will give even to my enemy, and will not have grown poor for doing so. In a sense of, again, that point of not only love your friend, but also treat them like a challenge for your own opinions, your own biases for things, and in doing so you become richer as an individual through being able to reevaluate and challenge yourself. So now let's get into our film discussion for this section. So a great wee film is The Breakfast Club from 1985. It's a bit of a cult classic movie. So let's discuss a little bit of the plot as well. That'll set us up nicely. This time the plot's from imdb.com. Beyond being in the same class at Shermer High School in Shermer, Illinois, Claire Standish, who's played by Molly Ringwald, Andrew Clark, who's played by Emilio Estevez, John Bender, who's played by Judd Nelson, Brian Johnson, who's played by Anthony Michael Hall, and Alison Reynolds, who's played by Ali Sheedy, have little in common, and with the exception of Claire and Andrew, do not associate with each other in school. In the simplest and in their own terms, Claire is a princess, Andrew an athlete, John a criminal, Brian a brain, and Alison a basket case. But one other thing they do have in common is a 9-hour detention in the school library together on Saturday, May 24th, 1984. Under the direction of Mr. Vernon, supervising from his office across the hall, each is required to write a minimum 1,000-word essay during that time about who they think they are. At the beginning of those 9 hours, each, if they were indeed planning on writing that essay, would probably write something close to what the world sees of them and what they have been brainwashing to believing themselves. But based on their adventures during that 9 hours, they come to a different opinion of themselves and the other four. So Breakfast Club is definitely a great wee movie in which you've got the sort of stereotypical wee cliques or groups in high school that's illustrated as well. So you've got Emilio Estevez's character being the typical into sports or jock type character, and then Anthony Michael Hall being your typical sort of nerdy character, and all these different types of stereotypes all sat in next to each other. And what's great as well is that you would think in that given instance they would just not get along with each other because they have such different family backgrounds, such different interests. There'd be no way in those 9 hours that they would get along with each other. But they do, of course. And what's interesting as well is through the course of the movie, those norms and expectations and those social boundaries that's been set upon them within the given context of school starts to become broken down. And then they start to evaluate and critically think about their own place within the school. And as well as they make those points as well, after this detention, will you hang out with such and such? And then they say, well, of course I will. And then there's a whole thing of, no, you really wouldn't. And then why wouldn't I? And so it gets that nice sort of discussion starting to happen, and that whole lovely breaking down and questioning the stereotypes and their own roles within the school. And of course, what happens as well is that you can see without those given context and boundaries as well, that they would all manage to get along quite lovely together as a nice group of friends despite their differences. And it makes me think of another high school movie as well, of Mean Girls, which is from 2004, in which the main character is played by Lindsay Lohan and it's called Katie Heron. And then they have this main group basically in the school called the Plastics, and the main leader of that group, played by Rachel McAdams, is called Regina George, and then underneath her is two of her little underlings as well. And so that fits nicely into the whole Nietzsche thing about the tyrant, represented by Regina George, the queen bee of the group, and then her two little underlings, of course, being the slaves. And then what makes Lindsay Lohan ultimately a great friend in that movie is that the underlying plot is for her to subvert and destroy basically that Plastics as a group. And what's great about that movie is that by the time you get to the end of it as well, not only does Lindsay Lohan's character realize how much of a horrible person she was being by being in that group in the first place, but she's also able to then critically reflect upon her own social and cultural sort of norms that are placed upon her in the sort of same sense that they do in Breakfast Club as well. And then she gets back to sort of basics, and what she actually wants to focus on is her learning and also her love of mathematics that she has in the movie as well. And on the other side of things, with the Regina George side of things as well, there's that same sort of critical reflection that also happens. And by the time you get to the end of the movie, there is no more Plastics as a group whatsoever. That Regina George herself as a person becomes better through releasing all the aggression and so forth she has, not against other people, not making other people feel horrible, but ultimately doing it a much more productive way through sports. And the same thing for Lindsay Lohan's character, is able to reconcile with all her friends that she'd lost by becoming the new queen bee temporarily in the movie as well. Why is that clash so important? Because it's precisely that clash that allows us to advance thought, advance ourselves as people, and allows us to always critically think and challenge ourselves. And it's through challenging ourselves that we improve as people. Moving on to the next section then, of the 1001 Goals. Zarathustra has seen many lands and many peoples. Thus he has discovered the good and evil of many peoples. Zarathustra has found no greater power on earth than good and evil. No people could live without evaluating, but if it wishes to maintain itself, it must not evaluate as its neighbor evaluates. Much that seemed good to one people seemed shame and disgrace to another. Thus I found much that was called evil in one place was in another decked with purple honors. One neighbor never understood another. His soul was always amazed at his neighbor's madness and wickedness. A table of values hangs over every people. Behold, it is the table of its overcomings. Behold, it is the voice of its will to power. What it accounts hard, it calls praiseworthy. What it accounts indispensable and hard, it calls good. and that which relieves the greatest need, the rare, the hardest of all, it glorifies as holy. Whatever causes it to rule and conquer and glitter, to the dread and envy of its neighbour, that it counts the sublimest, the paramount, the evaluation, and the meaning of all things. Truly, my brother, if you only knew a people's need, and land, and sky, and neighbour, you could surely divine the law of its overcomings, and why is upon this ladder that it mounts towards its hope. So in this initial little section then, we have Nietzsche challenging the ideas of good and evil being something that's completely pure and separate from society or culture that makes it up. Ultimately, what he's picking at away at the problem here is the traditional role in philosophy that morality has, that when we reflect upon what is good, we reflect upon what is universally accepted as good. So let's say we could all universally accept that murder is wrong, and we can hold that up as a good thing. So traditionally, when you can do that and you hold it up universally, it also becomes timeless. It's not limited to a given time period or a given set of people, but quite the opposite of that, can be upheld regardless of social, cultural differences, and throughout time, everybody can agree upon a certain idea as being always good, and the same thing there as always evil. But what Nietzsche argues is quite the opposite of that. Our ideas of what is good and what is evil is not something that is timeless at all, but rather something that's timely, and that is to say that our ideas precisely are determined by the time period, the society and culture as well that we're brought up in, all affects how we think upon what we think is good and bad. And so it's not something in a pure sense of it whatsoever. And what we can see as well, to back up his point there, is that if you have in one given country, you have a certain value as upheld as good, then you can have a clash with another country who holds up exactly the same thing as evil or a bad thing to do. And a really easy example of that, of course, is the death penalty, where certain countries still uphold the death penalty as a correct action and good action to take, such as Japan and also in Texas in the United States, whilst as other countries and other states as well in America completely disagree with the use of the death penalty altogether. What that conflict shows then is very important, is that very idea of good is not something that's absolute, but precisely comes into conflict as soon as we start to look at other countries and other ways of thinking about things. And this ties into Nietzsche's other book called The Genealogy of Morality, and Nietzsche's concept of genealogy, which is a really easy concept to understand because people really love doing a family history. And so you get these websites like Ancestry.com where you can then go and trace your family history and learn all about your background. Whilst Nietzsche in The Genealogy of Morality does exactly the same thing, but instead of course tracing your family history, he goes and traces the ideas of what is good and evil and precisely adds a history into that, and again to show that how we think at a given time period is always determined by our social cultural constructs that we live in. Continuing on then, you should always be the first and outrival all others. Your jealous soul should love no one except your friend. This precept made the soul of a Greek tremble. In following it, he followed his path to greatness. To speak the truth, and to know well how to handle bow and arrow. This seemed both estimable and hard to that people from whom I got my name, a name which is both estimable and hard to me, to honor father and mother, and to do their will even from the roots of their soul. Another hung this table of overcoming over itself, and became mighty and eternal with it, to practice loyalty, and for the sake of loyalty to risk honor and blood, even in evil and dangerous causes. Another people mastered itself with such teaching, and thus, mastering itself, it became pregnant and heavy with great hopes. Truly men have given themselves all their good and evil. Truly they did not take it, they did not find it. It did not descend to them as a voice from heaven. Man first implanted values into things to maintain himself. He created the meaning of things, a human meaning. Therefore he calls himself man, that is, evaluator. Evaluation is creation. Hear it, you creative men. Valuating is itself the value and jewel of all valued things. Only through evaluation is there value, and without evaluation the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear it, you creative men. A change in values, that means a change in the creators of values. He who has to be a creator always has to destroy. Peoples were the creators at first, only later were individuals creators. Indeed, the individual himself is still the latest creation. So Nietzsche initially then gives us some values that have been created by different sets of peoples throughout different ages. And first he gives us the Greek one, the next that he highlights Persian way, and then the Jewish, and then finally the German. And in each given case, what the point is that he's highlighting as well, each of them has their own different values that they've created in order to overcome themselves, in order to try and be better individuals and better societies. And that's the point as well, when values are created and ideals are created that everybody has to then uphold. It's not something that's pure, it's not something that's God-given, it's not a set of commandments that's handed down to us, let's say, but ultimately those commandments are man-made, and the things that have given meaning to us, and that those very values themselves are a human creation and are not completely pure. And that's what's lost, of course, in the midst of all this complete repetition and upholding the values as something that's absolute and something that's pure and something that's always going to be good for us. We forget actually, well, this is a set of people at a given time period that has created these values for a specific reason. At that given time period, it might have been a great thing to uphold this. But Nietzsche's point as well is, does this value have any worth now? Is it practical for us now? Is there any harm that it's actually causing more than it's being beneficial for us if we uphold it still today? This point then builds upon Nietzsche's fantastic argument here. He who has to be a creator always has to destroy. So in the sense as well, he's not completely arguing against for any sense of ethics or morality whatsoever. Rather, we need to have that moment of critical reflection upon the given values at a given time period and think about whether these are still good for us now. And in order for it to be good for us, we need to be able to destroy the values of the past. There has to be a destruction of values in order for new values to emerge. Why is that the case? What does destruction ultimately mean? Destruction then would have that relation into immobility. Once something is upheld to the point where it becomes completely inflexible, completely tyrannical, you have to agree with this absolutely. There's no room for argument. Well then, Nietzsche's point is very philosophical, and to say, well, then we have to destroy that value because we always have to allow for a value to be challenged, always allow for our process of thinking to take place. Of course, it goes into really fantastic examples here of imagine a situation in which we're stuck back in the 1950s, back in an incredibly oppressive society for Black Americans or for homosexuals. Could you imagine if those same ideals are upheld as still something that's good to be upheld? Could you see and think about the harm that would cause if we still upheld those same values? Why is it so great as well in that progression? Precisely because we've been able to challenge a whole way of thinking, and precisely to problematize a whole way of thinking as well. And through that, you're able to completely break down a whole way of thinking and show it to be completely false, harmful, and moving on to a much more progressive and beneficial model for people. So rounding off the section, once the peoples hung a table of value over themselves, the love that wants to rule and the love that wants to obey created together such tables as these. Joy in the herd is older than joy in the ego, and as long as the good conscience is called herd, only the bad conscience says I. Truly the cunning, loveless ego that seeks its advantage in the advantage of many, that is not the origin of the herd, but the herd's destruction. It has always been creators and loving men who created good and evil. Fire of love and fire of anger glow in the names of all virtues. Zarathustra has seen many lands and many peoples. Zarathustra has found no greater power on earth than the works of these loving men. These works are named good and evil. Truly, the power of this praising and blaming is a monster. Tell me, who will subdue it for me, brothers? Tell me, who will fasten fetters upon the 1,000 necks of this beast? Hitherto there have been 1,000 goals, for there have been 1,000 peoples. Only fetters are still lacking for these 1,000 necks. The one goal is still lacking. Yet tell me, my brothers, if a goal for humanity is still lacking, is there not still lacking humanity itself? Thus spoke Zarathustra. And then we have the psychology coming out for what type of people create these values in the first place. It's the tyrants, on the one hand, that wants to rule over a bunch of other people by getting them to obey whatever they say. And on the other, how do these rules get accepted? Because it's the slaves and the herd mentality that adores and worships what they say that allows for these values to be upheld. So again, we sort of end up in a Regina George from Mean Girls and our subordinate situation. And then Nietzsche's saying here, look at the power that good and evil and ethical models have upheld within centuries. And you only need to look at, of course, organized religions of the world to just see the incredible amount of power and effect ethics has upon everybody and their way of thinking. But Nietzsche's also saying here, look at the harm that these models have in the sense of what they uphold is ultimately to be timeless models for our actions and our thoughts. But that's so harmful. It's so harmful that it's like a giant monstrosity and monster that needs to be tamed, because it doesn't allow for any critical reflection. It doesn't allow for anybody to come around and challenge what people are saying and challenge these values that are being upheld. So it's that kind of beautiful line just there at the end. If a goal for humanity is still lacking, is there not still lacking humanity itself? It's sort of really poignant point in which you have all these different ethical models, all these different things that is upheld to be good and bad for humanity over how much ever centuries. But ultimately what we do is we create these massive ideal systems, metaphysical systems. And what do we forget about in the midst of all that is humanity itself, and viewing the here and now in a positive way, viewing our bodies in a positive way, viewing critical thinking in a positive way. Is that point as well that we're so much paranoid about controlling us and paranoid about what people are going to do that we forget about all the good things about humanity at the same time. And so a great movie to illustrate this point at the end of this section is The Day After Tomorrow from 2004. And it can really be applied to any sort of disaster movie in general. It doesn't have to be specifically this one. But for The Day After Tomorrow, the plot, I'm not going to go into too much depth as well. I'm just going to give you the one wee quick sentence. The film depicts catastrophic climactic effects following the disruption of the North Atlantic Ocean circulation and in a series of extreme weather events that usher in global cooling and lead to a new ice age. And of course the great poster, I think is a picture of New York as well, just absolutely covered in ice and snow. Why are post-apocalyptic movies so good in illustrating this point is that once you get rid of all the barriers, once you get rid of all the ethical models, once you get all the diversity completely gone and everybody has to sort of start from scratch in a very much state of nature situation as well, what do people focus on is the bare basics about things. How do I survive? I need warmth. I need food. And it's a really quite beautiful point as well that in the midst of all this that Nietzsche's really arguing for, that people get so caught up in their death, what's their afterlife going to be like, am I living a good life, that they not only don't live for the here and now, but they're also not just enjoying themselves in their life. And life is something to be enjoyed. And how do we enjoy life is through that very simple point of having food, having shelter, having clothes, having companionship. And there's a great wee point in the movie where everybody's sitting around a wee flaming barrel and they bring out a book of Nietzsche's. I can't remember exactly which one. And then they have a little discussion about Nietzsche, as you do whilst you're freezing, of course. And then they're thinking about what books they need to burn and whether to throw Nietzsche on the fire or not. But that's kind of like the point. In the midst of all this, they try and think, oh, let's try and save some things that we think's important and burn the others. The ironic point as well, not only is knowledge saved by whoever thinks that it's good at a given time period with this set of thinkers, and then lost to time of the other set that's burned, but also, isn't that the point in itself? Surely it's more important to have the warmth there rather than to think about, oh, such and such is important, we better save that book, or we can't save that book because they thought such and such. It doesn't matter at that given point. What matters is our own basic humanity and just need to live, or as Nietzsche would say, that will to power, which is just that drive that we all have within us in order to keep on living. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the sections of Friends and 1001 Goals. Feel free to email me at my address dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can also be found on Twitter at I'm a Rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you join us next time.